just in case there were things. And then I was like, then I can make sure that it's good to go by 5:45, and that's when I'll start reading.
And what book will you be reading to me?
I will be reading To Kill a Mockingbird, sweetheart.
Looking forward to it.
You're looking forward to it?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know why.
Any N-words tonight?
I'm sure there will be at least one. You're looking forward to it? I don't know why.
What was that?
That's just my playback. I'm sure there will be at least one. The only complaint with HelloFresh is they do want us to use like 8,000 dishes for every meal. I use a bowl and a skillet for the green beans.
What was the bowl for?
I don't know.
Was it like ice bath?
Was it? No, it wasn't an ice bath.
Thoughts on dinner?
It's whatever. I think this is probably, I mean, the flavors are really good. I just think that it does not cost what we paid for it.
I agree with that. Which chicken was this?
This is the honey one.
What happens our cat doing?
I don't know. Mort, what are you doing? Mort. Mort.
Thank you for dinner, though.
No problem. Can you guys hear me okay? If you can't, let me know. Throw down a message in the chat if I need to speak louder or softer, if I need to go locate some sort of like headset. I mean, I have a headset, but I look really goofy in it. So I would prefer not to use that. But it changes colors. It's actually my husband's. See? Ta-da! But in order to use it, I have to yell into it, and I don't like that. feel like such a goofball doing this, though. I'm excited, but nervous. Cinch. We'll start here in a few minutes. I just wanted to give people time in case they needed to get to their computers or phones and to finish my green beans. Or be right back. I just wanted to make sure, Hattie. You're the one that's been yelling at me in text because you didn't have the link. I'm sorry. All right, guys, we'll start in about 5 minutes. Comfy?
Mhm.
You gonna go snip our garden hose?
Mm-hmm. Great tub and dining room, Goodwill bin.
Great tub and dining room is the Goodwill bin. Where's the cat?
He was upstairs with me and then he came downstairs.
Did he? Mort! Mort! I heard him, I bet.
Hey, bud. Guess he just went to the bedroom.
Mort!
No, he's getting off down here.
Come here, bud! Mort, come here! Mort! Mort! I don't have kids, so I feel like I'm supposed to show him off, even though he hates it, and he won't sit here this whole time. But he's pretty cute. All right, folks, we're going to get started. This should take about 30 minutes. I looked up the other readers, and that's about how long it takes. So in about 30 minutes, we'll be done. Don't forget to answer at least 2 questions from chapter 11, and that's all we're reading today is going to be chapter 11. And then we'll actually be done with the first part of the novel. The first part of the novel is kind of just your exposition and getting to know the town. The second part is going to be mostly the story of the trial and of Tom Robinson. All right, so I'm going to get started. If you want to read along with me, or if you're somebody that is reading along with me, please, and he's gone. Please open up your books to page 132. If not, and you're just listening, that's totally fine too. You're kind of allowed to do whichever way you want. That's the kind of the purpose of tonight. But I hope you enjoy this, and let's get started. All right. So chapter 11 of To Kill a Mockingbird. When we were small, Jem and I confined our activities to the southern neighborhood. But when I was well into 2nd grade at school and tormenting Boo Radley became passé, the business section of Maycomb drew us frequently up the street past the real property of Mrs. Henry Lafayette DeBose. It was impossible to go to town without passing her house unless we wished to walk a mile out of the way. Previous minor encounters with her left me no desire for more, but Jem and I had to grow up sometime. Mrs. DeBose lived alone except for a Negro girl in constant attendance, 2 doors up the street from us in a house with a steep front step and dog trot hall. She was very old. She spent most of each day in bed and the rest of it in a wheelchair. It was rumored that she kept a CSA pistol concealed among her numerous shawls and wraps. Jem and I hated her. If she was on the porch when we passed, it would be raked by her wrathful gaze. We would be raked by her wrathful gaze, subjected to ruthless interrogation regarding our behavior, and given a melancholy prediction on what we would amount to when we grew up, which was always nothing. We had long ago given up the idea of walking past her house on the opposite side of the street. That only made her raise her voice and let the whole neighborhood in on it. We could do nothing to please her. It was as if I said as suddenly as I could, "Hey, Miss DeBose," I would receive for an answer, "Don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl. You say good afternoon, Mrs. DeBose." She was vicious. And once she heard Jem refer to our father as Atticus, and her reaction was apoplectic. Besides being the sassiest, most disrespectful mutts who ever passed her way, we were told that it was quite a pity that our father had not remarried after our mother's death. A lovelier lady than our mother never lived, she said, and it was heartbreaking the way Atticus Finch let her children run wild. I did not remember our mother, but Jem did. He would tell me about her sometimes, and he went livid when Mrs. DeBose shot us this message. Jem, having survived Boo Radley, a mad dog, and other terrors, had concluded that it was cowardly to stop at Miss Rachel's front steps and wait, and had decreed that we must run as far as the post office corner each evening to meet Atticus coming home from work. Countless evenings Countless evenings, Atticus would find Jem furious at something Mrs. DeBose had said when we went by. Easy does it, son, Atticus would say. She's an old lady, and she's ill. You just hold your head high and be a gentleman. Whatever she says to you, it's your job not to let her make you mad. Jem would say that she must not be very sick. She hollered so. When the three of us came by her house, Atticus would sweep off his hat, wave gallantly to her, and say, "Good evening, Mrs. DeBose. You look a picture this evening." I never heard Atticus say, like, a picture of what. He would tell her of the courthouse news and would say he hoped that with all his heart she'd have a good day tomorrow. He would return his hat to his head, swing me to his shoulders in her very presence, and we would go home in the twilight. It was times like these that I thought my father, who hated guns and had never been to any wars, was the bravest man who had ever lived. The day after Jem's 12th birthday, his money was burning up in his pockets, so we headed for town in the early afternoon. Jem thought he had enough to buy a miniature steam engine for himself and a twirling baton for me. I had long had my eye on the baton. It was a VJ Elmore's. It was bedecked with sequins and tinsel, and it was 17 cents. It was then my burning ambition to grow up and twirl at the Macomb County High School band. Having developed talent to where I could throw up a stick and almost catch it coming down, I had caused Calpurnia to deny me entrance to the house every time she saw me with a stick in my hand. I felt I could overcome this defect with a real baton, and I thought it was generous of Jem for him to buy me one. Mrs. DeBose was stationed on her porch when we went by. "Where were you two going this time of day?" she shouted. "Playing hooky, I suppose. I'll just call up the principal and tell him." She put her hands on the wheels of her chair and executed a perfect right face. "Aw, it's Saturday, Miss DeBose," said Jem. "Makes no difference if it's Saturday," she said obscurely. "I wonder if your father knows where you are." "Mrs. DeBose, we've been going to town by ourselves since we were this high." Jem placed his hand palm down about 2 feet above the sidewalk. "Don't you lie to me," she yelled. Jeremy Finch, Maudie Atkinson told me you broke down her Scuppernong arbor this morning. She's going to tell your father, and then you'll wish you never saw the light of day. If you aren't sent to reform school before the week, my name's not DeBose." Jem, who had been near Miss Maudie's Scuppernong arbor since last summer, and who knew Miss Maudie wouldn't tell Atticus if he had, issued a general denial. "Don't you contradict me," Mrs. DeBose bawled. "And you," she pointed an arthritic finger at me. "What are you doing in those overalls? You should be in a dress and camisole, young lady. You'll grow up waiting on tables if somebody don't change your ways. A Finch waiting on tables at the OK Cafe." Ha! I was terrified. The OK Cafe was a dim organization on the north side of the square. I grabbed Jem's hand, but he shook me loose. "Come on, Scout," he whispered. "Don't pay any attention to her. Just hold your head high and be a gentleman." But Mrs. DeBose held us. Not only a Finch waiting on tables, but one in the courthouse lawn for niggers. Jim stiffened. Mrs. DeBose's shot had gone home, and she knew it. Yes, indeed, what has this world come to, with Finch going against what his raising? I tell you, she put a hand on her mouth, and when she drew it, it trailed a long silver thread of saliva. "Your father's no better than the niggers and trash he works for." Jem was scarlet. I pulled at his sleeves, and we were followed up the sidewalk by Philippic on our father's moral denigration, the major premise of which was half the Finches were in the asylum anyway. But if our mother was living, we would not have come to such a state. I wasn't sure what Jem resented most, but I took umbrage at Mrs. DeBose's assessment of the family's mental hygiene. I had become almost accustomed to hearing insults aimed at Atticus, but this was the first one coming from an adult. Except for her remarks about Atticus, Mrs. DeBose's attack was only routine. There was a hint of summer in the air. In the shadows it was cool, but the sun was warm, which meant good times were coming. No school, and dill. Jem bought his steam engine, and we went by Elmore's for my baton. Jem took no pleasure in his acquisition. He jammed it in his pocket and walked silently beside me toward home. On the way home, I nearly hit Mr. Link Dees, who said, "Look out now, Scout," when I missed a toss. And when we approached Mrs. DeBose's house, my baton was grimy from having picked it up out of the dirt so many times. She was not on her porch. In later years, I sometimes wondered exactly what made Jem do it, what made him break the bonds of "you must be a gentleman's son," and the phase of self-conscious rectitude he had recently entered. Jem had probably stood as much guff about Atticus lawn for niggers as I had, and I took for granted that he kept his temper. He had naturally tranquil disposition and a slow fuse. At the time, however, I thought the only explanation for what he did was for that few minutes he simply went mad. When Jem did something I do as a matter of course, had I not been under Atticus's interdict, which I assumed included not fighting horrible old ladies, we had just come to her gate when Jem snatched my baton and ran, flailing wildly up the steps into Mrs. DeBose's front yard, forgetting everything Atticus had said, forgetting that she packed a pistol under her shawls, forgetting that if Mrs. DeBose missed, her girl Jessie probably wouldn't. He did not begin to calm down until he had cut the tops off of every camellia bush Mrs. DeBose owned, until the ground was littered with green buds and leaves. He bent my baton against his knee and snapped it in two and then threw it down. By that time I was shrieking. Jem yanked my hair, said he didn't care, he'd do it again if he got the chance, and if I didn't shut up, he'd pull every hair out of my head. I didn't shut up, and he kicked me. I lost my balance and fell on my face. Jem picked me up roughly by looked like he was sorry. There was nothing to say. We did not choose to meet Atticus coming home that evening. We skulked around the kitchen until Calpurnia threw us out. By some voodoo system, Calpurnia seemed to know all about it. She was less than satisfactory source of palliation, but she did give Jem a hot biscuit and butter, which he tore in half and shared with me. It tasted like cotton. We went to the living room. I picked up a football magazine, found a picture of Dixie Howe, showed it to Jem. He said, "This looks like you." That was the nicest thing I could think to say to him, but it was no help. He sat by the windows, hunched down in a rocking chair, scowling, waiting. Daylight faded. 2 geological ages later, we heard the soles of Atticus's shoes scrape the front steps. The screen door slammed. There was a pause. Atticus was at the hat rack in the hall, and we heard him call, "Jem!" His voice was like a winter wind. Atticus switched on the ceiling light in the living room and found us there, frozen still. He carried my baton in one hand. Its flimsy yellow tassel trailed on the rug. He held out in his other hand. It contained fat camellia buds. "Jem," he said, "are you responsible for this?" "Yes, sir." "Why'd you do it?" Jem said softly, "She said you lawed for niggers and trash." "You did this because she said that?" Jem's lips moved, but his "yes, sir" was inaudible. "Son, I have no doubt that you've been annoyed by your contemporaries about me lawing for niggers, as you say, but to do something like this to a sick old lady is inexcusable. I strongly advise you go down and have a talk with Mrs. DeBose," said Atticus. "Come straight home afterwards." Jem did not move. "Go on," I said. I followed Jem out of our living room. "Come back here," Atticus said to me. I came back. Atticus picked up the mobile press and sat down in the rocking chair Jem had vacated, and for the life of me, I did not understand how he could sit there in cold blood and read that newspaper when his only son stood an excellent chance of being murdered with a Confederate Army relic. Of course, Jem antagonized me sometimes until I could kill him, when it came down to it, he was all I had. Atticus did not seem to realize this, or if he did, he didn't care. I hated him for that. But when you are in trouble, you become easily tired. Soon I was hiding in his lap, and his arms were around me. "You're mighty big to be rocked," he said. "You don't care what happens to him," I said. "You just send him out there to get shot when all he was doing was standing up for you." Atticus pushed my head under his chin. "It's not time to worry yet," he said. "I never thought Jem would be the one to lose his head over this. Thought I'd have more trouble with you." I said I didn't see why we had to keep our heads anyway, that nobody I knew at school had to keep his head about anything. "Scout," said Atticus, "when summer comes, you'll have to keep your head about far worse things. It's not fair for you and Jem, I know that, but sometimes we have to make the best of things. And the way we conduct ourselves when the chips are down, well, all I can say is, when you and Jem are grown, maybe you'll look back on this with some compassion and some feeling that I didn't let you down. This case, Tom Robinson's case, is something that goes to the essence of man's conscience. Scout, I couldn't go to church and worship God if I didn't try to help that man." "Atticus, you must be wrong." "How's that?" "Well, most folks seems to think they're right, and you're wrong." "Well, they're certainly entitled to think that, and they're entitled to full respect of their opinions," said Atticus. "But before I can live with other folks, I've got to live with myself. The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience." When Jem returned, he found me in Atticus's lap. "Well, son," said Atticus. He set me on my feet, and I made a secret reconnaissance of Jem. He seemed to be in one piece, but he had a queer look on his face. Perhaps she had given him a dose of calomel. I cleaned it up for her and said I was sorry, but I ain't, and that I'd work on them every Saturday to make them grow back out. There was no point in saying you were sorry if you aren't, said Atticus. Jem, she's old and ill. You can't hold her responsible for what she says and does. Of course. I'd rather she'd have said it to me than to either of you, but we can't always have our druthers. Jem seemed fascinated by a rose in the carpet. Atticus, he said, she wants me to read to her. Read to her? Yes, sir. She wants me to come over every afternoon after school and Saturdays and read to her out loud for 2 hours. Atticus, do I have to? Certainly. Well, she wants me to do it for a month. Then you're going to do it for a month. Jem planted his big toe delicately in the center of the rose and pressed it in. Finally, he said, Atticus, it's all right on the sidewalk, but inside, it's all dark and creepy. There's shadows and things on the ceiling. Atticus smiled grimly. That should appeal to your imagination. Just pretend that you are inside the Radley house. Page 141. The following Monday afternoon, Jem and I climbed the front steps to Mrs. DeBose's house and padded down the open hallway. Jem, armed with Ivanhoe and full of superior knowledge, knocked on the second door on the left. Mrs. DeBose, he called. Jessie opened the wood door and unlatched the screen door. Is that you, Jem Finch? She said. You got your sister with you? I don't know. Let them both in, Jessie, said Mrs. DeBose. Jessie admitted us, and we went off to the kitchen. An oppressive odor met us when we crossed the threshold, an odor I had met many times in rain-rotted gray houses where there are coal oil lamps, water dippers, and unbleached domestic sheets. It always made me afraid, expectant, watchful. In the corner of the room was a brass bed, and in the bed was Mrs. DeBose. And I wondered if Jem's activities had put her there, and for a moment I felt sorry for her. She was lying under a pile of quilts and looked almost friendly. There was a marble-topped washstand on her bed. On it were a glass with a teaspoon in it, a red ear syringe, a bottle of absorbent cotton, or a box of absorbent cotton, a steel arm clock standing on 3 tiny legs. So you brought that dirty little sister of yours, did you? She said with a greeting. Jem said quietly, my sister ain't dirty, and I ain't scared of you. Although I noticed his knees were shaking. I was expecting a tirade, but all she said was, you may commence reading, Jeremy. Jem sat down in the cane-bottomed chair and opened Ivanhoe. I pulled up one and sat beside him. Come closer, said Mrs. DeBose. Come to the side of the bed. We moved our chairs forward. This was the nearest I had ever been to her. The thing I wanted most to do was to move my chair back again. She was horrible. Her face was the color of a dirty pillowcase, and the corners of her mouth glistened with wet, which inched like a glacier down the deep grooves enclosing her chin. Old age liver spots dotted her cheek, and her pale eyes had pinpoint pupils. Her hands were knobby, and cuticles were grown up over her fingernails. Her bottom plate was not in, and her upper lip protruded from time to time. She would draw her nether lip to her upper plate and carry her chin with it. This made the wet move faster. I didn't look any more than I had to, but Jem reopened Ivanhoe and began reading. I tried to keep up with him, but he read too fast. When Jem came to a word he didn't know, he just skipped it, but Mrs. DeBose would catch him and make him spell it out. Jem read for perhaps 20 minutes, during which time I looked at the soot-stained mantelpiece, out the window, anywhere to keep from looking at her. As he read along, I noticed that Mrs. DeBose's corrections grew fewer and farther between. That Jem had even left one sentence dangling in midair. She was not listening. I looked toward the bed. Something had happened to her. She lay on her back with the quilts up to her chin. Only her head and shoulders were visible. Her head moved slowly from side to side. From time to time, she would open her mouth wide, and I could see her tongue undulate faintly. Cords of saliva would collect on her lips. She would draw them in, then open her mouth again. Her mouth seemed to have a private existence of its own. It worked separate and apart from the rest of her, out and in like a clam hole on low tide. Occasionally, it would say, "Psst," that some vicious substance be coming to a boil. I pulled Jem's sleeve. He looked at me, then at the bed. Her head made its regular sweep towards us, and Jem said, Mrs. DeBose, are you all right? She did not hear him. The alarm clock went off and scared us stiff. A minute later, nerves still tingling, Jem and I were on the sidewalk, headed home. We did not run away. Jessie sent us. Before the clock wound down, she was in the room, pushing Jem and me out of it. Shoo, she said. You all go home. Jem hesitated at the door. It's time for her medicine, Jessie said. As the door swung shut behind us, I saw Jessie walking quickly towards Mrs. DeBose's bed. It was only 3:45 when we got home, so Jem and I drop-kicked in the backyard till it was time to meet Atticus. Atticus had 2 yellow pencils for me and a football magazine for Jem, which I suppose was a silent reward for our first day's session with Mrs. DeBose. Jem told him what happened. Did she frighten you? Asked Atticus. No, sir, said Jem, but she's so nasty. She has fits or something, spits a lot. She can't help that. When people are sick, they don't look nice sometimes. She scared me, I said. Atticus looked me over with glasses. You don't have to go with Jem, you know. The next afternoon at Mrs. DeBose's was the same as the first, and so was the next until gradually a pattern emerged. Everything would begin normally. That is, Mrs. DeBose would hound Jem for a while on her favorite subjects, her Camillas, and our father's nigger-loving propensities. She would grow increasingly silent, then go away from us. The alarm clock would ring, Jessie would shoo us, and the rest of the day was ours. Atticus, I said one evening, what exactly is a nigger lover? Atticus's face was grave. Has somebody been calling you that? No, sir. Mrs. DeBose calls you that. She warms up every afternoon calling you that. Francis called me that last Christmas. That's where I first heard it. Is that the reason you jumped on him? Asked Atticus. Yes, sir. Then why are you asking me what it means? I tried to explain to Atticus that it wasn't so much that Francis had said that it infuriated me as the way he had said it. It's like he said snot nose or something. Scout, said Atticus. Nigger lover is just one of those terms that doesn't mean anything. Like snot nose, it's hard to explain. Ignorant, trashy people use it when they think somebody's favoring Negroes above themselves. It's slipped into usage with some people like ourselves, with the want common ugly term to label somebody. You aren't really a nigger lover then, are you? I certainly am. I do my best to love everybody. I'm hard put sometimes, baby. It's an insult to be called what somebody thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you. So don't let Mrs. DeBose get you down. She has enough troubles of her own. One afternoon, a month later, Jem was plowing his way through Sir Walter Scott, as Jem called him, and Mrs. DeBose was correcting him at every turn. And then there was a knock at the door. Come in, she screamed. Atticus came in. He went to the bed and took Mrs. DeBose's hand. I was coming from the office and didn't see the children, he said. I thought they might still be here. Mrs. DeBose smiled at him, and for the life of me I couldn't figure out how she could bring herself to speak to him when she seemed to hate him so much. Do you know what time it is, Atticus? She said. Exactly 14 minutes past 5. The alarm clock's set for 5:30. I want you to know that. It suddenly came to me that each day we had been staying a little longer at Mrs. DeBose's, that the alarm clock went off a few minutes later each day, and that she was well into one of her fits by the time it sounded. Today she had antagonized Jem for nearly 2 hours with no intention of having a fit, and I felt hopelessly trapped. The alarm clock was the signal for our release. If one day it did not ring, what would we do? I have a feeling that Jem's reading days are numbered, said Atticus. Only a week longer, I think, she said, just to make sure. Jem rose. But Atticus put out his hand and Jem was silent. On the way home, Jem said he had to do it for just a month. The month was up, and this wasn't fair. Just one more week, son, said Atticus. No, said Jem. Yes, said Atticus. The following week found us back at Mrs. DeBose's. The alarm clock had ceased sounding, but Mrs. DeBose would release us with, "That'll do," so late in the afternoons that Atticus would be home reading the paper when we returned. Although her fits had passed off, she was in every other way her old self. When Sir Walter Scott became involved in lengthy descriptions of moats and castles, Mrs. DeBose would become bored and pick on us. Jeremy Finch, I told you you'd live to regret tearing up my Camillas. You regret it now, don't you? Jem said he most certainly did. Thought you could kill my snow on the mountain, did you? Well, Jessie says the tops are growing back out. Next time you'll know how to do it right, won't you? You'll pull them up by the roots, won't you? Jem said he certainly would. Don't you mutter at me, boy. You hold up your head and say, yes, ma'am. Don't guess you'll feel like holding it up, though, with your father what he is. Jem's chin would come up, and he would gaze at Mrs. DeBose with a face of devoid resentment. Through the weeks, he had cultivated an expression of polite and detached interest, which he would present to her in answer for most of her blood-curdling inventions. At last the day came when Mrs. DeBose said, "That'll do." One afternoon she added, "And that's all. Good day to you." It was over. We bounded down the sidewalk on a spree of sheer relief, leaping and howling. That spring was a good one. The days grew longer and gave us more playing time. Jem's mind was occupied mostly with vital statistics of every college football player in the nation. Every night Atticus would read to us the sports pages of the newspapers. Alabama might go to the Rose Bowl Rose Bowl again this year, judging from its prospects. Not one of those whose names we could pronounce. Atticus was in the middle of Wendy Seaton's column one evening when the telephone rang. He answered it. Then he went to the hat rack in the hall. I'm going down to Mrs. DeBose's for a while, he said. I won't be long. But Atticus stayed away until long past my bedtime. When he returned, he was carrying a candy box. Atticus sat down in the living room and put a box on the floor beside his chair. What'd she want? Asked Jem. We had not seen Mrs. DeBose for over a month. She was never on her porch anymore when we passed. She's dead, son, said Atticus. She died a few minutes ago. Oh, said Jem. Well is right, said Atticus. She's not suffering anymore. She was sick for a long time. Son, didn't you know what her fits were about? And Jem shook his head. Mrs. DeBose was a morphine addict, said Atticus. She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctor put her on it. She had spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary. Sir, said Jem. Atticus said, just before your escapade, she called me to make her will. Dr. Reynolds told her she had only a few months left. Her business affairs were in perfect order, but she said, there's still one thing out of order. What was that? Jem said, perplexed. She said she was going to leave this world, beholden to no one, nothing, and nobody. Jem, when you're sick as she was, it's all right to take anything and make it easier, but it wasn't all right for her. She said she didn't mean to break herself of it before she died. She said she meant to break herself of it before she died, and that's what she did. Jem said, you mean that's what her fits were? Yeah, that's what they were. Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt she heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on the alarm clock. If you hadn't fallen into her hands, I'd have made you ready to go and read to her anyway. It may have been some distraction. There was another reason. Did she die free? Asked Jem. As a mountain air, said Atticus. She was conscious to the last. Almost conscious, he smiled, and cantankerous. She still disapproved heartily of my doings, and said I'd probably spend the rest of my life bailing you out of jail. She had Jessie fix you this box. Atticus reached down and picked up the candy box and handed it to Jem. Jem opened the box, and inside, surrounded by wads of damp cotton, was white, waxy, perfect Camilla. It was a snow on the mountain. Jem's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Old hell devil, he screamed, flinging it down. Why can't she leave me alone? In a flash, Atticus was up and standing over Jem. Jem buried his face in Atticus's shirt front. Shh, he said. I think that was her way of telling you that everything's all right now, Jem. Everything's all right. You know, she was a great lady. A lady? Jem raised his head. His face was scarlet. All of those things she said about you, a lady? She was. She had her own views about a lot of things, a lot different from mine, maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd made you go and read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is instead of getting the idea of that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. DeBose won, all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and to nobody. She was the bravest person I ever saw. Jem picked up the candy box and threw it in the fire. He picked up a Camilla, and when I was off to bed, I saw him fingering the white petals. Atticus was reading the paper. All right, guys, you are done. We are done with the reading for tonight. That means that we will be starting on chapter 12 for tomorrow, and I'm sure this is backwards, so I don't even know why I'm showing it to you. Make sure you get at least 2 questions done for chapter 11. But that is all of the reading I have for you tonight. So have a great night, and I will see you guys later. Bye.